more than half of the asylum seekers we offer support to are from the Northern Triangle of Central America. More people from the Northern Triangle region sought affirmative asylum in the United States between 2013 and 2015 than in the previous 15 years combined. There are more than 300,000 people that flee every year from that region. Many of today's immigrant justice advocates were shaped by the movement against US intervention in Central America in the 80s. Many of the people here today remember the events of those years. And today we'll be talking about what has changed since the 80s and what remains the same, which is very important to ground ourselves in, especially how it might affect how we support the people who are fleeing from that region today. Great. So now I'm going to turn it over to Kate, who is our executive director, and she also has a doctorate in Latin American and Caribbean studies. Before coming to CASP, she conducted research on armed conflict, social movements, and natural resource grabs in Latin America. For 10 years, she taught undergraduate classes in Latin American history and politics, social movements, armed conflict, and international development.
Thank you, Christy. And thank you, everybody, for coming. So as I expected, there's a lot of memory and knowledge in this room. A lot of people in this group seem to have been involved in some way in solidarity with Central America, if not in other ways. In the 1980s, that was certainly true for my family. When I was 5 years old, my father was briefly taken hostage by the Contras in Nicaragua, and that was a very formative experience for me. And I credit that sometimes with having pursued this work. School of the Americas, this is a huge one. We'll talk about this in a minute. The Iran-Contra affair probably is remembered as a political scandal by many people. Bananas, even when it makes it to like popular media. Yellow journalism, good thing that's ended. Murders of nuns and churchwomen, and Óscar Romero, who was killed on March 24th, 42 years ago. Civil wars, targeting of indigenous peoples, alliances between governments. US scared of Central America becoming like Cuba, becoming like later what we would think of as Venezuela, right? Back then we were mostly just fine with Venezuela. Chile and Allende. So Jonathan talked about, parallel movements, also part of the same military operations happening in South America and the Southern Cone, slightly before this era. Afraid of communists. I don't know if the person who posted it was afraid of them or if they're saying that the government was afraid of them. And then a lot of stuff happening stateside, right? Central America Organizing Project. Remember being in a room with women who were sharing their survival tactics that they developed while being tortured in order to prevent their comrades from being tortured in the same way 10 minutes later. Very, very powerful stuff. Active movement in the United States to expose and oppose military forces. Solidarity with Central American struggles in our US communities. Somebody had a long-term relationship with a refugee family in LA, that was probably Anna. Imperialism happening all over the world, right? Not just in Latin America, but in Africa, all of it variations on a theme. There was here in Southern Vermont, a family with Mayan ancestry living at Weston Priory out in Weston for 25 years, which I didn't know. Folks in Sanctuary in Austin, Texas. So the Sanctuary movement, I know a lot of folks were probably involved in that. Yeah, this is great. This is a ton of stuff. We'll talk about this later. How do the armed conflicts in Central America relate to migration? And then the other question I kind of wanted folks to answer was, where does your knowledge stop, right? Everything you shared on that first Jamboard, lots and lots of notes about the 1980s, maybe a little bit early 90s. Where does it stop? Did you know as much about Central America in the 90s or the aughts as you did about the 80s? If not, what changed? What changed in Central America? What changed in terms of US foreign policy? Susan said, I lost touch with Central American politics in the aughts. There were distractions in the Middle East, right? I think this is common. Thank you for that. So what I'd like to talk about is a little bit of just sort of a timeline, more of a thematic timeline in terms of some things that were happening in Central America generally, a little bit of specifics, and bring together some of your memories into a sort of a coherent narrative. And then focus in after that on what's happened since and what's happening in Honduras today. Oh, I'm not able to move this down, am I? Yes, I am. Great. So there's a lot to say about the US role in Central America. I've started here, of course, before the 80s, mostly because 1954 and the coup d'etat in Guatemala is usually cited as the first example of the kind of intervention, the Cold War intervention, that would come to define the 80s. So Guatemala's quote unquote civil war, which really is a campaign of state terror much more than it is a civil war between two equal sides, begins quite a bit further back and sort of laid the groundwork for a number of things happening in the region, including the Cuban Revolution, was the inspiration, you know, along with what was happening in Cuba, the inspiration for a lot of Latin Americans to travel to Cuba and prevent what had happened in Guatemala from happening in Cuba several years later. So in Guatemala in 54, there was a democratically elected president named Jacobo Arbenz. And Jacobo Arbenz was overthrown by the CIA in 54. It was the CIA's second big action internationally. It had only just been formed a year or two beforehand. And first it intervened in a coup in Iran in 1953, and then in Guatemala in 1954. The CIA helped to overthrow Arbenz after he nationalized and purchased fallow land that was being held by the United Fruit Company, which is today Chiquita. The United Fruit Company at the time was based in Boston, was the largest holder of land in Central America, owned all kinds of infrastructure, railroads, schools, the postal service, I think in Guatemala was owned by the company. So they were the economy. And they had lots and lots of land that wasn't being used, that they would hold in between crop cycles. And Arbenz nationalized it and forced the company to sell it in order to give access to land to farmers. The United Fruit Company had several inside advantages, including two of their lawyers, John Foster Dulles, who was US Secretary of State, and his brother Alan, who ran the CIA. So lots and lots of inside baseball there. The company hired Sigmund Freud's nephew, oddly enough, to do its public relations, and was able to convince much of the US Congress and public that Arbenz was a communist and a homosexual, two things that were closely tied in the public mind at that time. After Arbenz was overthrown in 54, Guatemala was plunged into a US-funded state terror campaign led by US-trained soldiers and death squads, which by 1996 would kill more than 200,000 Guatemalans. More than 80% of them were indigenous. Similar patterns erupted elsewhere in Central America over the following couple of decades. People probably remember in 1979, when Nicaraguan Sandinistas finally deposed their right-wing government and took the capital, redistributing land and resources to the country's poor. A coup in El Salvador a few months later ushered in another campaign of state terror aimed at avoiding in El Salvador what happened in Nicaragua. The Carter administration, and especially the Reagan administration, heavily funded and trained the Salvadoran military, equipping it to carry out massacres, disappearances, and the famous violence against Catholic priests, nuns, and churchwomen. And the four faces at the bottom here are the four nuns, US nuns and churchwomen who were raped and killed in 1980. 70,000 victims of El Salvador's state terror campaign included many priests and nuns and churchwomen. And then in the early 80s, the Reagan administration famously, as many people remembered, channeled illegal funding to the former National Guard of Nicaragua, now known as Contras, based just over the northern border in Honduras, who used that funding to kill most of the 30,000 victims of the armed conflict in Nicaragua. As somebody also remembered in the Jamboard, many of the perpetrators of this state terror were trained in the United States in various institutions, mostly at the US Army School of the Americas, which before 1984 was based in Panama and is now at Fort Benning, Georgia. Training manuals that were since declassified from the school reveal a curriculum of state repression, torture, execution, disappearance, blackmail, and persecution of student groups, labor groups, and church groups. Honduras is often left out of this narrative because it didn't suffer a coup during those years. Instead, Honduras was used as the US military's planning and staging ground, becoming home to a huge concentration of USAID projects, Peace Corps volunteers, and militarization. In line with these projects, or at least at the same time as these projects, the Honduran government surveilled its citizens, brutally repressed labor organizers, and anyone else who was building the kind of progressive movement that had become so prominent in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala at the time. Honduras was the launching pad not only for the 1954 coup in Guatemala, but also the Contra War against Nicaragua in the 1980s. The result was a massive ballooning of Honduras's military budget and military infrastructure, which will become relevant later as we talk about today. We'll do that part next. So where did folks go from Central America when they fled? Between 1980 and 1990, the number of Central Americans in the United States tripled. Because the United States was a supporter of the wars they were fleeing, it was not considered politically expedient to grant asylum to Central Americans. Before 1991, only 2% of Central American asylum cases were successful in the United States. This meant that Central Americans here were mostly undocumented, which suited US industry just fine. Farming, meatpacking facilities, factories, and domestic service all benefited from the exploitability of migrant labor. Every time I've taught this history in college classes, students are always their minds are blown by why would we do this? Wasn't this a clear thing that we shouldn't be doing? Why would the US public permit this to happen? And I think Reagan gave this speech in, I think, 83, advocating for more military involvement in Central America. And I think it will remind us what the climate was like at the time and what fears he was able to marshal to get away with what he got away with.
I'm going to lose the TV time. Members of the Congress, I have the high privilege and distinct honor of presenting to you the President of the United States.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, distinguished members of the Congress, honored guests, and my fellow Americans. A number of times in past years, members of Congress and a president have come together in meetings like this to resolve a crisis. I have asked for this meeting in the hope that we can prevent one. It would be hard to find many Americans who aren't aware of our stake in the Middle East, the Persian Gulf, or the NATO line dividing the free world from the communist bloc. And the same could be said for Asia. But in spite of, or maybe because of, a flurry of stories about places like Nicaragua and El Salvador, and yes, some concerted propaganda, many of us find it hard to believe we have a stake in problems involving those countries. Too many have thought of Central America as just that place way down below Mexico that can't possibly constitute a threat to our well-being. And that's why I've asked for this session. Central America's problems do directly affect the security and the well-being of our own people. And Central America is much closer to the United States than many of the world trouble spots that concern us. So we work to restore our own economy. We cannot afford to lose sight of our neighbors to the south. El Salvador is nearer to Texas than Texas is to Massachusetts. Nicaragua is just as close to Miami, San Antonio, San Diego, and Tucson as those cities are to Washington, where we're gathered tonight. But nearness on the map doesn't even begin to tell the strategic importance of Central America, bordering as it does in the Caribbean, our lifeline to the outside world. 2/3 of all our foreign trade and petroleum pass through the Panama Canal and the Caribbean. In a European crisis, at least half of our supplies for NATO would go through these areas by sea. It's well to remember that in early 1942, a handful of Hitler's submarines sank more tonnage there than in all of the Atlantic Ocean. And they did this without a single naval base anywhere in the area. And today the situation is different. Cuba is host to a Soviet combat brigade, a submarine base capable of servicing Soviet submarines and military air bases visited regularly by Soviet military aircraft. Because of its importance, the Caribbean basin is a magnet for adventurism. We're all aware of the Libyan cargo planes refueling in Brazil a few days ago on their way to deliver medical supplies to Nicaragua. Brazilian authorities discovered the so-called medical supplies were actually munitions and prevented their delivery. You may remember that last month, speaking on national television, I showed an aerial photo of an airfield being built in the island of Grenada. Well, if that airfield had been completed, those planes could have refueled there and completed their journey. If the Nazis during World War II and the Soviets today could recognize the Caribbean and Central America as vital to our interest, shouldn't we also? For several years now, under two administrations, the United States has been increasing its defense of freedom in the Caribbean basin. And I can tell you tonight, democracy is beginning to take root in El Salvador, which until a short time ago knew only dictatorship. The new government is now delivering on...
Yeah, what does that bring up for folks?
Really, the distracted reality that I guess many like me were living through. And it was amazing knowing what I know about Ronald Reagan. It was amazing to see the reception in Congress for him, because he was on the edge of this whole, I mean, this was a national an embarrassment, and he was defending himself. But boy, it sure went over my head. And national press, I think.
Yeah. And remember, this was pre-internet, right? There wasn't a YouTube.
Yeah.
People couldn't do Facebook Live videos of war the way that they do today. So people in this country relied, first of all, on journalism, and then increasingly on these, human rights and solidarity delegations that were sent by, U.S. churches and organizations, and then came back and reported on what was actually happening on the ground. And that really, in collaboration with groups in Central America that were distributing reports and pushing a more accurate narrative, really helped to change that narrative. But it was people, right, who made that happen.
I think 30, 40 years ago, we were just starting to really, or some of us were just starting to connect the dots about the corporate power. And I think that really neat podcast you had us listen to really put that out there, where they said there were 3 phases. And it started with the corporations making a complaint because of what was asked of them. And then it got, switched to, the poor people there. And I think we're so much more savvy about that now. Not that it's done that much good. I think it's just shown us the power, the utter power of the oligarchs and the corporations.
Yeah, absolutely. And that they were able to take advantage of a long-standing neo-colonial system in Latin America. You know, I mean, we didn't have time to go this far back, but remember that in a lot of the Central American and Caribbean countries, the local police were installed and trained by the US Marines after the Marines pulled out of those countries in the 20s. So these are, you know, state repressive apparatuses that were intentionally oriented toward repression of the poor in favor of corporate profit. It's on purpose. It's not an accident, right? And we see, you know, still today, I mean, fruit companies, Chiquita, Dole, Del Monte are all sort of tagged with hiring paramilitaries to repress dissent and repress their labor movements. But yeah, it does seem like the US consciousness was growing about that during this time.
Well, I think that some of the changes were the various people-to-people things that happened, and you know, maybe started by Kennedy and Peace Corps, but there were a lot of other organizations independent of that. And when people came back and they'd been in countries and they'd lived there, then sister cities started. I mean, I got involved in Nicaragua because of a sister city that I was part of forming in Concord, Mass, where I lived. And we had high school students going back and forth. And so I think there was a lot more contact that people had because they had lived in countries and had learned about them and had gotten interested in following what was going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the Peace Corps is such an interesting node in this history, right? I mean, the Peace Corps was pretty expressly started as a way to minimize revolution, you know, and a way to make US policy look friendlier. But then you have all these young folks who have on the ground face-to-face experiences, and maybe it doesn't have the effect that it was intended for.
I can't separate out this whole narrative, the history of this, from the colonial attitude of the United States and the inherent racism. So it feels like part of the story, why it was so easy to ignore it, why it was so easy to avoid pressure on the press to share the stories, why it never really made it into schools. Really, I mean, those of us who went to South America or Central America to do any work were exceptional people, but it doesn't seem to have become a cultural issue. Yeah, I mean, I just can't separate it out because it's not quite so simple as the history, because there's so much else that was condoned, actually, in terms of our country.
Well, and racism in particular towards Central America is part of history, right? I mean, Central America and the Caribbean, because they're sort of at the, you know, confluence of all these different cultural and political and military flows, were, according to sort of scientific racism, as we now call it, before this era, were a mongrel race. They were, you know, we used to measure their heads and say that they couldn't possibly have the intelligence capacity that white people had, right? I mean, this is all relatively recent history in the 80s. Yeah, so there's an enormous amount of racism and white supremacy that's happening. You know, we saw those folks as laborers and backward peasants, and they were occupying land that we really wanted to use, right? John, you had your hand up.
Yeah, just add a quick postscript to Libby's point and your point, which it's sad that it's not just the 80s, it's right now. I mean, Biden came on today, I believe, or yesterday, proudly saying 100,000 Ukraine refugees will be brought into the United States, which is great. Can you imagine him standing up and saying 100,000 Hondureños will be brought to the United States? It's not, you know, or people from Mexico. So you just see the stark difference. And
yeah, absolutely. And that's, you know, leads right to the last point I wanted to make about this was, you know, how we received people at the end of this era. And in 1990, the United States passed the Immigration Act of 1990, which decreased the number of visas for so-called low-skilled workers. as it increased the number of visas overall, which essentially allowed the US to claim that it was serving the needs of immigrants and diversifying its pool of immigrants, while cementing the fact that Central American workers in this country were forced into an exploitable and underground labor pool without access to the resources of citizenship. So, that's essentially the reward that we handed folks at the end of that period, was a limited number of visas for the people who were fleeing the wars that we ceded. Right? In 1990. And one of the things that came up in our initial discussion was what happened to our attention after that point. And I want to talk about that a little bit. So a lot of things happened after 1990. Specifically, in 1991, you have the fall of the Soviet Union, right? This is obviously going to play a huge role in what we're afraid of. These campesino armies throughout Central America maybe didn't seem as threatening if they weren't being funded and resourced by the USSR. And a lot of those countries, Cuba in particular, also Central America, faced a huge wave of poverty because of the lack of that support. Also, Susan pointed out, things were happening in the Middle East and we were distracted, right? So-called Operation Desert Storm happened around this time. The US public and the US press, or I should say the US press and therefore the US public, started to pay a lot more attention to things that are happening in the Middle East than things that are happening in Central America. There are also, as we're going to see, a wave of peace agreements that happened, which allowed us to think that the problem was over, that the wars were over, that things would be safe. Our international discourse refocused from communism to terrorism as the biggest threat. Interestingly, a lot of the actors were exactly the same. A lot of the dynamics were the same. A lot of the threats were the same, but they were now threatening to us because of terrorism and not because of communism. This is true particularly with armed groups in Latin America. Global war on terror, of course, balloons after that point, and is still going on, right? And so Central America just sort of fades into the periphery of our focus. It doesn't mean that Central American violence faded, or I should say that violence in Central America faded. But I think political analysis began to see that violence as not an expression of political motives, right? We started to see it as economic violence, opportunistic violence, violence for no reason, not violence that was expressing a political and economic human need, which is the way we interpreted the actions of armed rebel groups in the 80s, including some of the rebel groups that, liberals and progressives in the United States often supported. And that brings us to, now what we know in the last 5, 6, 7 years, what we know of Central America is what Trump called these bad hombres, right? These gang members with tattooed faces who terrorize communities and send caravans of innocent people clamoring for entry at the southern border, right? Somehow in those 2 decades, the press narrative of Central American violence has been divorced from itself, right? It always seems to me, and folks may disagree about this, that there's a gap between how the 80s and the 2000s and the 2010s and the 2020s are all part of the same process, and how they're connected and how they flow into one another. So that's what I'd like to talk about a little bit. The other thing that I forgot to mention was, Susan, when you said the thing about being distracted by what's happening in the Middle East, one of the clear facts that I find so compelling is the way in which the 2 wars are themselves connected, right? The war on terror used the same officials, the same tactics, and often the same goals of the state terror in Central America, right? Oil plays a huge part in both. In 2005, in fact, the Bush administration proposed what they called the Salvador option in Iraq, which was to fund and train undercover death squads to combat Sunni resistance in Iraq rather than doing it with the US military. Exactly the same way that the Salvadoran military was able to outsource its violence to these small independent groups in order to avoid accountability. So, I mean, it's the same officials. It's Rumsfeld, it's Negroponte, it's Abrams, it's Powell. All of them sort of cut their military teeth during the Central American wars in the 80s and then graduated to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and brought a lot of their learnings with them. But somehow, we often forget that those things are directly connected. We all look the other way, right? And the violence in Central America is exported or spread. Okay. So a couple sort of, public facts are happening in Central America during that time. In 1990 was the end of the Sandinista government. At least as of then, it was the end of the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Violeta Chamorro was elected. 1992 saw a peace accord in El Salvador. 93, the Salvadoran Truth Commission released a report clarifying some of the atrocities that took place. 96 was a peace accord in Guatemala. 99, the Guatemalan Truth Commission released its report on atrocities. The same year, Bill Clinton publicly apologized to the country of Guatemala, which was at least a big deal for PR. And then, following those peace deals is two processes referred to as DDR and transitional justice. DDR refers to disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, which is going to be important because it's the way that states deal with their combatants after a war. When you have thousands of people mobilized for one side or the other, you've got to do something with those people, right? They need jobs, they need housing, they need education, they need to be convinced to turn in their weapons. They need to be somehow integrated into civilian society so that they don't just continue to fight. And that's going to be relevant to what happens. So that reintegration takes place in the context of economic processes that were ongoing, right? So reintegration of soldiers and guerrillas takes place in the context of structural adjustment, of free trade, and of natural disaster. And all three of those things are going to take funding, resources, and priorities away from supporting and reintegrating former combatants. Anybody know what structural adjustment is? Is this a common knowledge for most folks? I can't see everybody's face. Janet, you look very knowledgeable there for a minute. So structural adjustment essentially refers to strings that are attached to loans. International banks, like the International Monetary Fund, give out loans to impoverished countries, mostly in the global south, in exchange for those countries realigning their economies in line with Washington's priorities. So those priorities are usually fairly opportunistic for our own economy. And from the perspective of someone living in those countries, those adjustment policies slash social spending. They reorient the budget toward debt reduction. They eliminate space for the resources necessary to usher in real peace, right? There is less funding for education, fewer job prospects, no government aid, no credit, nothing for farmers, privatization of industry, privatization of seeds so that people can no longer save their seeds and regrow crops the next year. They're reliant on, Monsanto and Cargill and those kind of corporations which benefit from structural adjustment. Massive urbanization takes place because the farming economy is dead, but people come to, yes, Susan, austerity policies, thank you. People come to the cities for jobs and there aren't enough. So you see the ballooning of slums and shantytowns around Latin American city centers. Austerity measures refers to slashing social spending, right? Part of social spending, a big part of social spending in these time periods was support for people who were laying down their weapons, and they just did not receive it. Everything in the economy was aimed at debt reduction, was aimed at maquila production, was aimed at monocrop exports, and not for, getting high school diplomas for people who had just demobilized from the Contras, for example. Hurricanes devastate Central America in this time period. Climate change starts to hit very hard. Hurricane Mitch in 1999 cost Honduras 70% of its GDP. That's how much of the economy was taken by Hurricane Mitch. CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement in 2005, sort of cements some of those economic policies that had been part of structural adjustment. It tied Central American economies to the United States, devastating the farming economy that remained. US was able to dump cheap crops, which also devastated farmers. It reduced access to affordable medicine because of patent agreements. It further privatized land and industry during this time. So, you know, the combatants who had been, let's say they had mobilized in the Contras or the counter-revolutionaries, or they had mobilized in one of the guerrilla organizations, or they had mobilized in the army, or were part of death squads, or were part of paramilitaries, did not have a trade to graduate into. Many of those folks were able to migrate to the United States. And Christy, if you can load up that part of that Susan Mycelis video, we'll see an interview with a demobilized Contra about his experiences at the end of that process.
La contrarrevolución o la contra, como nos llamaban, nosotros tuvimos posibilidades de ganar la guerra y siempre las tuvimos. Nosotros no, nadie pelea para perder. El que lucha y expone lo más preciado que tiene, que es su vida, lucha para ganar. Ningún soldado sería mentiroso el que diga que él entró a una guerra y que sabía que se iba a perder o que se iba a empatar. Todos esos combatientes luchamos para ganar, ¿no? Y el esfuerzo que hacemos y lo que apostamos es nuestra vida, ¿no? Entonces yo aposté la mía, ¿no? Y parte de mi vida quedó en esta guerra, ¿no? Mis heridas en esta guerra fueron por mi país, ¿no? Nunca fue por la política americana, ¿no? Mis comandos que murieron por mi Nicaragua, ¿no? Moríamos y luchábamos por nuestros ideales, por lo que creíamos. Pero era triste, ¿no? La guerra era una guerra política, nos usaban a nosotros, tanto a los sandinistas como a nosotros. Estábamos jugando una guerra de potencias. A los sandinistas les daban armas, los rusos, a nosotros nos apoyaban los Estados Unidos. Y ellos decían con nosotros, comenzaron a jugar con nosotros de una manera hasta cierto punto deshonesta, ¿no? Aprendí una gran lección, aprendí una lección en mi vida. La lección que aprendí fue que mejor lucho por mí mismo y no lucho por los demás, porque cuando uno está en una organización, en cosas así que son supeditadas, uno es más que todo un muñeco que se quita, se pone, se mueve a gusto del que patrocina. Así fue esta guerra, ¿no?
Luis Moreno, Onduri, high chipping, 7 to 8, over.
Sí, señor. I copy that time. Gracias y buenas noches.
Okay, thank you very much. Over.
Yeah, so this Contra fighter was able to leave Nicaragua and settle in Miami, which many Contra fighters were able to do. Immigration from Nicaragua during that time was I don't know if he's authorized or not, but it was authorized at higher levels than other countries in Central America for political reasons. So he left, got out, is working as a security guard. Not everybody got out who was demobilized, right? Not everybody who was trained to fight and had nothing else on offer was able to get out. You heard him saying there, I've learned one thing, which is to fight for myself, not to fight for other people. And this, you know, sort of giving up on collective solutions is something that some people have sort of credited to the end, and in some cases what they term, you know, the failure of the leftist movements, the defeat, better said, of the leftist movements. So, you know, you have this huge population of demobilized fighters who have learned how to fight and not learned how to do a lot of other things. And because of slashes to social spending, there are no opportunities for them. There is a job available, and that is to join a gang, right? There is a form of protection available to you since your government is not able to do it, and that is to join a gang. So, you know, you have this dynamic where the neoliberal restructuring of the economies makes new livelihoods impossible, makes old livelihoods impossible, Ex-combatants couldn't meet their basic needs. What they knew how to do was fight. The Soviet Union was gone. There was no funding for social programs for the poor. The only peace that was on offer was a Pax Americana led by the United States. Gangs then are a form of resistance in that view, right? Survival is a form of resistance. Let me share my screen again. So what gangs provide is a mode of resistance, a mode of survival, an insistence on one's own worth. And what they're met with is an increasing militarization of the state's repressive apparatus to combat the gangs. So countries throughout Central America begin what are called mano dura policies, or iron fist, heavy-handed policies, which essentially use military funding to encourage those countries to pursue the gangs using any means at their disposal, which ends up meaning, of course, that a lot of innocent people are killed, followed soon after by, of course, the counterattacks by the gangs. And so gang violence just ramps up and up and up and up throughout the 90s. Yeah, so the other two things I think that are relevant as we move into the 2000s, one is economically speaking, there's this huge mineral boom all over Latin America, which means that there's a lot more investment in things like mining, agrofuels, hydroelectric dams, lots and lots of investment pours in, especially after CAFTA has passed in 2005. And what that means is that mining companies and other sort of mega project companies are looking for land. And a lot of the time, that land is occupied by indigenous people, Afro-Central Americans, and campesinos and the poor, right? Then in 2007, 2008, there's a global food price crisis. Things get even more dire in terms of the poverty from Latin America, and you start to see why there's so much displacement, why there's so much migration taking place toward the United States. Many people might be familiar with Subcomandante Marcos, who was a spokesperson for the Zapatistas in Chiapas, Mexico for a long time. And one of the things he said about the state in general in Latin America and all over the world at this time period was, we are witnessing a striptease. The state takes off everything down to its underwear, that indispensable intimate undergarment, which is repression, which is a way of saying that the state isn't doing anything for us anymore except repressing us, right? There's no credit for farmers, there's no education funding, there's no healthcare funding, there's no daycare funding, there's no, anything except funding the police and the military, so that people's needs are increased, but their modes of accessing those needs are decreased. So what happens to the poor in the 90s and the 2000s? Massive militarization of national budgets, long-standing alliances between landlords, landowners, and the police, resource boom, which results in land grabs by corporations that need to take land for profit, the death of the farming economy, which used to hold up an entire, proportion of the population, anti-indigenous violence, gender violence is on the rise during this time with the onset of the gangs. And people have probably more than two modes of resistance, but at least two modes of resistance, one of which is migration and one of which is gang protection. And people have, used both of those things or done one in order to escape the other. And both modes of resistance or escape are met with militarized repression. People are hit from all sides during this time. They're impoverished, they're trained to fight, they're starved, harassed, oppressed, pushed out. One resistance strategy is dangerous and met with iron fist policies. One is dangerous and met with border walls, surveillance towers, robo-dogs, detention centers, family separation, factory labor, ICE raids, and deportation. There's a lot of information, and I want to see if anybody has questions or comments or insights that I missed.
I have a question. What happened to the farming economy? What specifically went into tearing that apart?
Global economic policies went into tearing that apart. Also climate change and hurricanes and flooding and drought, especially in the latter portion of that period. But, starting in the early 80s, countries throughout Latin America are sort of forced into these structural adjustment policies which takes away any support for farmers. So there's no startup capital for farmers. There's no, farmers have to borrow money at the beginning of the season, and they usually, in most countries, do that from the government. My grandfather was a farmer and got loans at the beginning that were then paid back when the harvest came in. And that was the same in Latin America, but that was no longer an option. So that combines with free trade policies that privatize publicly held land, that privatize species of crops so that people are no longer allowed to save their own seeds. Yes, deforestation, ED is a huge issue, both as a result of climate change and as a result of corporate encroachment on forests, right? And the free trade policies enabled the United States to dump cheap crops into Latin America. So, NAFTA, for example, enabled us to dump all of our subsidized corn such that people couldn't grow corn anymore for a profit.
That's right.
Yep.
Thanks.
Yeah, and that's key, Susan. That Susan points out in the chat that a lot of the one of the biggest gangs in Central America, which is called the Mara Salvatrucha or MS-13, began in Los Angeles as a resistance strategy in U.S. prisons and detention centers. And by deporting those folks without any, again, no reintegration policies, you're essentially exporting gang violence that actually began here. Jonathan?
So I might have missed this, you might have touched on it already, but I was just thinking about how, like, you had talked about how kind of in the moment, like with the Cold War ending, like the military industrial complex sort of needed a new place to put its energy and resources. And so there's this shift from focusing on like immigration and on Central America to like the global war on terror. And I think that also brings up kind of the way that then also feeds back into like border enforcement and repression of migrants, where like ICE, was created in 2003 as a response to, as a response kind of to 9/11 as part of the global war on terror. And around the same time, like Border Patrol's number of I guess officers would be the word, doubled from 10,000 to 20,000, which is still pretty much where it is today. And so, these processes are, it's not just like one transition, but again and again, they reinforce each other in these really, really harmful ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the most basic parts of that is we need to do something with the guns, right? Like we need to do something with the military equipment, and the countries that sell it at the end of the Cold War are panicked, right? Like we have all these contracts and now we're not going to get the contracts. And so, some of the members and business people who work for those arms dealers are also politicians or connected to politicians around the world, right? So we need to invent wars. Wars are profitable, They say war, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing. And it's like, well, except for corporate profit. It didn't rhyme though, so they left that out of the song.
Okay, talk a little bit about the role of the church amid all these conflicting tensions and just all the different social strands. The church hasn't been mentioned yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And the church's role was very prominent in the 1980s. And as a preacher's daughter, I can attest to that in my own life. And certainly the church continued throughout the 90s and of course throughout the 2000s and 2010s to offer material aid and support, and also advocating for policy change, right? David pointed out that AFSC has always been on top of the issue. Lots and lots of left-leaning groups in the United States, many of them church groups, have been. In fact, one of the key immigration decisions in the Supreme Court that allowed Central Americans to be authorized to be here was the ABC decision. The American Baptist churches sued the United States for preventing people from seeking asylum and won. So the churches absolutely took all kinds of roles.
Sounds like for the most part a helpful role.
Yeah, I don't know. That's the role I know because I was raised by liberal church people, but certainly not everybody, right? And there are lots, this is a fascinating question. There are lots of reasons for the rise in Protestant evangelicalism in Central America after this time, because Catholicism was then tarred as being pro-commie, right? And
sure.
so you have the rise of these very, you know, with all due respect to people who are part of those faith traditions, much more individualistic, much more focused on sort of prosperity gospel as opposed to like economic overhauls. And there's a whole zeitgeist around the world that happens at that time in that direction. Yeah.
Pretty complicated question in its own right, but thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, liberation theology, of course, is huge.
Right.
And remains, you know, today for many people, just isn't quite in the news as much because we're not worried about communists as much as we're worried about terrorists, even though a lot of those folks that we call those things are the same people. Right?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Let me talk a little bit about specifics in Honduras of sort of how this quote unquote crisis has played out. And crisis is obviously the wrong word. Honduras, as I said earlier, is often left out of the narrative because they didn't suffer coups in the 1980s. They ended up being sort of a military launching pad for a lot of other operations. That would change in 2009, much more recently. 2009, there was a coup d'etat in Honduras the President Jose Manuel Zelaya, who was ousted by a School of the Americas graduate trained in the United States named Romeo Vasquez, with the support of 200 troops, 6 months before the end of Zelaya's term. The coup was planned by a long-standing alliance between the Honduran elite and its military in response to the threat to their power that was posed by Zelaya's reforms. Specifically, Zelaya advocated for the creation of a constitutional assembly to revise the country's constitution, which was something that was happening all over Latin America at that time. People were setting aside their colonial era constitutions and coming up with new and more emancipatory constitutions that did things like recognize the rights of Black people. And so when Zelaya proposed this was a huge threat. They deposed him under the guise that if there were a new constitution, it might enable him to run again, and therefore it was seen as a power grab. Spoiler alert, after the coup, the next guy did end up running again and doing a power grab, but you know, they weren't worried about that one quite as much. The coup that overthrew Zelaya was unfortunately supported by the Obama administration. Zelaya was seen as a troublemaker. The US was worried about another Hugo Chavez taking hold. Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State at the time, pushed for moving on from the coup rather than trying to reinstate Zelaya, and pushed for holding elections before justice was served. Right after the coup, and this is another common sort of trend, so right after a new president was put in place with different views on economic policy, there was a massive wave of natural resource concessions. So lots and lots of contracts given out to big developers right after Zelaya was deposed. The people protested this and faced a brutal crackdown by a militarized police force. Since Zelaya was overthrown in 2009, tens of thousands of people have been killed in Honduras, including hundreds of LGBTQ people and indigenous people and land defenders. The targeting of all of these groups went way up after the coup. And this is something that directly has affected the asylum seekers that we serve. So Berta Cáceres was an indigenous Lenca land defender, an indigenous leader who won in 2015 the International Goldman Environmental Prize, which is a big famous deal for people who are defending environmental justice around the world. She won the prize for her organizing work against a land grab for a hydroelectric dam by a company called Agua Zarca, or rather the dam is called Agua Zarca.
Mi nombre es Berta Cáceres Flores y soy de una organización que se llama Consejo Cívico de Organizaciones Populares e Indígenas de Honduras, COPIN, y somos del pueblo Lenca. Estamos en un proceso de lucha, de activismo por la defensa de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas y hemos venido en un proceso de resistencia, bueno, como siempre lo han hecho los pueblos indígenas por más de 500 años. Y seguimos enfrentando el colonialismo actual. No es un crimen defender nuestros propios derechos como pueblos indígenas. El pueblo Lenca es un pueblo antiguo que habitó esta región mesoamericana, el suroccidente, centro de Honduras, una gran parte del Salvador también. Y este es un pueblo dedicado bastante a la tierra, su cosmovisión se centra en la tierra, en el maíz, en el equilibrio que debemos de guardar con todos los seres. Las transnacionales quieren invadir nuestros territorios. Ellos quieren privatizar nuestros ríos, el agua, los bosques a través de los proyectos de represas hidroeléctricas para la privatización de la energía. Nosotras pensamos que, o sea, esta lucha que nosotros vemos en la comunidad no es aislada, es una lucha y es un problema mundial, es un problema en este continente, que no solo lo enfrentamos nosotros, sino que todos los pueblos que luchan contra el colonialismo y que tienen sentido de justicia y por la emancipación. Todo el mundo piensa que en Honduras hay una situación normal y eso no es verdad. Aquí hay violación de derechos humanos, hay asesinato, hay represión, hay secuestro. Casi 3 millones de hondureños y hondureñas estamos desempleados en un país de un poco más de 7 millones. Es increíble y nosotras sabemos que al venir aquí es importante ser escuchadas. Tuvimos un debate alrededor de eso, mujeres de diferentes partes del país y bueno, un compartir desde la alegría también, porque si hay algo que nosotros sabemos después del golpe de Estado es que si nosotros no tenemos alegría en esto, entusiasmo y esperanza, estamos, como decimos nosotros, muertas en vida.
So Berta Cáceres was assassinated in 2016. The man who killed her was a West Point graduate named Roberto Castillo. He was supported by 2 other soldiers who graduated from the U.S. Army School of the Americas. Honduras has lots and lots of military folks who were trained in and by the United States. Castillo was also the president of the company that was building the dam that she was resisting. And the court concluded that he had used his military training provided at West Point to stalk her for many years prior to the assassination. Berta Cáceres was one of more than 130 people who have been assassinated for protesting dam construction, mega projects, and associated land grabs in Honduras since the time of the coup in 2009. In 2013, Honduras passed a new mining code, which allowed mining companies to operate with more freedom. The mining code was written by mining companies and offered to the government, kind of the way that ALEC sometimes writes legislation in this country. Let me see if I can get back to my screen share. So Berta Cáceres, I think, is a metonym or a symbol for broad processes of extraction, land dispossession, accumulation, the resource boom and its free trade agreements that enabled it, combined with the demobilized military forming gangs and paramilitaries that combined with racism to grab land from indigenous communities, use it for energy, use it for export. And this is facilitated by the availability of armed gangs to which the state and corporations can outsource their violence and make it invisible, right? So we have all of this sort of paramilitary death squad gang violence, which is very difficult to tie to the state. And it's often maybe slightly less difficult to tie to corporations. But it sort of becomes this notion of generalized violence and a really high murder rate in Honduras that we see as apolitical. But when we see what interests it's serving, it reveals itself as political, right? So Honduras in 2019 was the most dangerous country per capita for land defenders and environmentalists in the world. By 2021, Honduras was the second most dangerous country worldwide in terms of its homicide rate. And that's, I think, number 2 is still where it stands today. Earlier this year, Manuel Zelaya's widow took office as the country's first female president. She's very progressive, hopes are high, people are very excited about it. There has already been at least 1 coup attempt. And so hopes are high, fingers are crossed, eyes are on what's going to happen there. And I should say too that, the dynamics that lead to refugee and asylum seeker flight from Honduras also involve racism and sexism and homophobia in terms of who is targeted by violence, but that there are ways in which we can see that as not just, emerging from some natural Central American propensity to sexism and homophobia and racism, right? Years of militarization also increase racism, also increase sexism, also increase homophobia. Free trade policies also increase all three because they sort of mess with traditional gender roles. They sometimes can cement traditional gender roles. A lot of the maquila industry employs only young single women, which makes them targets of sexism, targets of homophobia. And so all these things there are lots and lots of linkages here, right? So when we talk about rising racism, sexism, and homophobia in Honduras, I don't want to give the impression that that's somehow, just something natural to Honduras. So what has changed in terms of US policy in Central America and its effects? Many of the priorities are the same, right? Much of the poverty is the same. Much of the narrative is the same. People who oppose the economic system are communists, or they're terrorists, or they're against development, but the people are the same, right? Some of the actors are different. There are gangs now. There aren't Contras anymore. Some of those people may be the same, right? There's a warmer and fiercer climate that's adding to this problem. And there is a fierce resistance, right, that has not been extinguished. I saw a documentary a couple months ago about Berta Cáceres that was called Berta no se murió, se multiplicó. Berta didn't die, she multiplied, right? There are huge movements of indigenous people, of Garifuna people in Honduras, Afro-Latin Americans, and there's CASP, right? And lots of organizations, both on the ground and here, that are opening their arms and their hearts and their communities to people who are fleeing this violence. And that makes a difference. But I think what I take away from, I was able to do a bunch of reading to prepare for this and remember some dynamics that I had forgotten about. And one thing that sticks with me is that the same violence that pushes migration from Central America is the violence that is necessary to invest the way that we do, right? So for US profits to be as high as they are from Central America, it requires repressive violence to submit people to the kind of exploitation that is necessary for our economic system. And so while we, talk about how terrible the gang violence is, we also are profiting from it. And that's troublesome. And that's what I want to talk a little bit more about. So first question, we serve 7 women and girls from Honduras. And this is just CASP. I know we've got folks from other organizations, so please feel free to answer this differently based on the folks you're serving right now. Does this information make you think differently about our approach to serving them? In other words, what does it look like, or what would it look like to support Hondurans?
Well, we certainly have to be cognizant of the trauma that they're coming from.
Yep.
That they've experienced.
Yeah. But that's true no matter where they come from, if they're asylum seekers for the most part.
Yep.
True, but I think the violence, it's likely to be violence from all directions.
Yep. And in 2021, there were sometimes 200 Honduran families a day at the border. That's just Hondurans.
And it's often sexual violence.
Absolutely. Yep. What often happens with asylum seeking families, and this isn't speaking of ours, is that one or more of the family's children has been a crime victim or received a direct threat from a gang, usually involving either forced recruitment as soldiers or, in the case of young women and girls, as sex slaves. Right? So yes, of course, there's trauma from everywhere, but particular dynamics of trauma. Yeah, so being cognizant of trauma, what else does support look like given these realities?
I'm going to add, have incredible respect for their resilience and courage.
I think we need to know how, or understand or accept how involved they are every day in what is happening in Honduras. They have family, they have friends that are there, and they follow it every day. And it's very important, and we need to understand and recognize that.
Yep. Yeah, it's not past trauma. It's not post-trauma, it's trauma. Right?
Current, yeah, current.
Thanks,
I
Edie.
mean, past also, but
Also,
but
ongoing.
right now, every day they see people they know who are killed, or they see forests deforested, you know, so it's happening every day to them.
Yep. So what does that do for our support? Realizing that there's trauma that's ongoing, past, current, and future.
And certainly part of the planning is what are the supports that we have in place that are really available in terms of therapeutic supports or women's supports or organizations like Umbrella or because they're woefully lacking, certainly in northern Vermont.
Yeah.
And probably in the rest of the state as well.
So, you know, realizing what the resources are in place to help us pull people out of that river of violence, right? What about going upriver to see what's throwing them in? Do we have a role in addition to supporting victims and survivors of Central American violence, given, you know, what we've been talking about in terms of the role of the United States? Is there a role in future trauma that we might play?
Well, I think we need to recognize the capitalist neoliberal business model that has put these people on their fleeing their countries, disrupting their economies, and creating a lot of the violence to suppress these people.
Yeah. At CASP, sort of, you know, in the various chats that we have on our staff, we often say that in addition to offering status to Afghans, the United States should offer status to victims of other US wars that are less discussed. In what ways do you think US intervention in Central America is or has been a war? What are the differences between one kind and another kind?
I think it's definitely been a war that's, we've paid for it. We've trained the perpetrators, and it hasn't stopped. It may have morphed. And in the case of Nicaragua, it's kind of confusing who's, you know, what's going on there now. But yeah, we need to continue to pressure our Congress people. And this is a good opportunity since we have an opening, which rarely happens in our for our one congressional seat. So those of us who are supporting one or the other, or this is the time to be asking questions in the congressional forums. What are people's positions? What are the candidates' positions, and what are they like? What can we hold them to? Should they become elected?
This is the time to collect promises, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
This is a little more to do with the last question, but I think that when in the study group where you've emphasized solidarity, not sympathy, that is so important. And that I think for a lot of folks, humanitarianism is like an entree into this whole thing. And people mean well, and they start with the sympathy. But when you've modeled this, I think CASP with the study groups and with this program, model having such a deep analysis, and at every opportunity when we can do that, when we talk to other people about whatever press group that they are supporting, it's just imperative in order for, you know, us to go beyond just being a Band-Aid. So thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, Barbara. I like the way that you phrased that. Yeah, sympathy is sort of easy to carry out, right? Solidarity involves taking risks. It involves standing with people in harm's way, right?
I'll mention, Kate, that that as an executive director of a different organization, advocacy is not easy to come by without dollars.
Absolutely.
And one very pragmatic way to help this effort is to speak with money, and the work that CASP is doing requires money, requires advocacy, which only comes through financial support.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you're able, and we really think we should, you can, if you're able, provide that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ruben. Yeah, I have thoughts on that maybe you and I can talk about.
I had a question related a little bit to what we were talking about before. Our organization doesn't have anyone from Central America, and I'm very curious what the route is by which you get your people. The people that I've dealt with from Honduras have all been in detention, and I've been communicating with them there. But I have to say that of all the people there, the Central Americans and Hondurans are the most likely to be deported very quickly.
Mhm.
And usually they don't have lawyers, so they can't appeal when they lose their cases. And let's face it, almost no one wins their case inside. So I'm curious how you get people out of detention, and is that a way that we might be able to help in some way?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, so I will say that the most recent family that joined us, who comes from Honduras, came to us through the Migrant Protection Protocols program. And we were contacted, somehow they got hooked up with an attorney who was working on the ground in the MPP program. And that attorney found us and called us. So that was a random accident. And then since then, several Honduran families have come to Vermont who knew this family. So there's a chain migration thing that happens. But prior to my time here, we were able to get 2 other Honduran families released from detention. And I wasn't here for those processes. So if you are in a position to do that, I would connect you with somebody else here at CASP who went through it. And also with Freedom for Immigrants out in San Francisco, who can guide on that process of sponsorship and, dealing with ICE and all that kind of stuff.
Right. I think we would be interested in finding out more about it. We can't accept a family tomorrow, but I'd like to learn more about it. I do think someone in our group is in touch with the California organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there are lots and lots of different ways. David just put one of the border shelters in the chat. There are lots of ways to get that to happen.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. This is about when you were asking about what about upstream? And I'm not super familiar with the work of CASP. And so my question is, does CASP have relationships with organizations in Honduras or other countries that the asylum seekers are coming from that are actually like on the ground working on these issues in their own countries? Because it seems like finding out how we can support those organizations in the actual countries that folks are coming from could be a way of moving, sort of how we can be in solidarity with them as living in the belly of the beast, and they're organizing on, and I just don't know if you have those relationships.
We have some relationships with advocacy organizations in the United States. We don't right now have relationships with orgs on the ground. That's one of the things that actually in the statewide network of asylum support organizations we're trying to develop for sort of post-deportation support. But I think that's a great idea, Ellen. And particularly in terms of maybe moving some resources, right? Like any way that we could offer logistical support, or let's say we have a fundraising event and we split it. Whatever comes in, we split with one of the advocacy organizations that's on the ground. I think that could be a really valuable way to sort of focus our awareness on what's happening.
It's very interesting thinking about if I were again interviewed by a local paper in Keene about the Mexican family that's now living with Project Home. If I were to say, generally, we don't say why they're leaving. We don't give too many details. But if I were to say, well, they're fleeing US economic terrorism in Mexico.
Thank you.
I don't think, I'm not sure, Kate, that I would say that.
Yep.
Because I'm not sure how useful that would be for the reception, but it's an interesting idea to play with, to imagine. That's a truthful answer. Whether I would use it as something else.
Or, once community members get to know that family, once you have a team surrounding that family, once you have people working with that family, then you say, do you know why they're here? Right. And of course, in some kind of way that protects privacy, it doesn't have to be about that family. But maybe we don't do it in the recruitment phase. Maybe we do it in the membership phase.
Yeah, and that may not be the specific, the line may not be so direct as these people had to give up their milpa because they could no longer sell their corn. That's not the case in this particular family's situation. But overall, systemically, that is what's going on. I'm also curious just to know what the Hispanic caucus in Congress, which is very varied. I mean, there's so much diversity of culture and of political opinion among the Latinx members of Congress. I would not assume any uniformity, but it would be very interesting to know what they think about upstream. Many are focused on what's happening in this country. Same thing with the churches, whether it's the Catholic or the Episcopal churches, which are very strong in a lot of their work with immigrants and refugees, but I don't know what they're doing about upstream.
Yeah, these are all exciting possibilities, and I think really, really good questions to ask. And I'm hoping, for those of us in the group who do serve on that bi-state network, it might be, a helpful impetus to get us to think about this a little bit more. So I just want to give many, many thanks to people for showing up for this. It's a lot of information. It's a lot of time, emotional investment, time investment, and we really appreciate it. It's been really nice to have a chance to get into some of this stuff and share it with all of you for how to support CASP financially. Thank you.